Welcome back, everybody, and I'd like to welcome back Dean Kavanagh, who's here for a second session to just discuss our project and some of the things that we didn't manage to get covered in the first session that we had the other week. So thanks for coming back.
Thank you, Mandy. Great to be here.
Nice to see you. I'd like to start off by, because last time in the last discussion that we had, you said that you were looking for a political home and looking to build connections, and one of the benefits of being involved in the Beehive project was, you know, obviously it was providing opportunities to extend the connections that you've been able to make through involvement in the left, but that you're not a member of a political party at the moment. Not necessarily looking for one at the moment. I would, well, I don't know, I don't want to put words in your mouth. So what I was going to ask you was, what do you think a political home for people who are on the left, who feel that they don't have a natural one at the moment, needs to look like? How might we get there?
Yeah, well, in terms of whether it concerns how politically homeless, yeah, I suppose the first breath, I like a lot of people after the Corbyn defeat, you know, it's taken about a year to sort of really reorientate and understand what the task is ahead, and you know where we should be basing our activity to build, you know, the political possibility that we saw even under a very weak way under Corbyn's leadership. And overwhelmingly, I don't think that's going to be the Labour Party in the coming period. So I'm sure we'll detail a bit more about that later. When we first started doing our discussions, Mandy, like with the political education projects last year, I think one of the things that was I was detecting at the time was that there was a lot of false sort of options being put before activists. There was a lot of sort of dead ends, I think, because after the defeat of Corbyn, there was a lot of political sort of alternatives that were starting to rise, such as George Galloway's the Workers' Party project. I know Chris Williamson, who was expelled obviously from the Labour Party, started to look at doing his own sort of festival and, you know, organisation outside of Labour. And I think there's even talk of like the trade union socialist coalition sort of being resurrected, which was formerly a coalition of left-wing socialist parties, the Railways Union, and a few others. And these are obviously natural consequences of the fall of Jeremy Corbyn. And I think we do need to, before we start rushing into some of these new projects that might seem quite exciting, we do need to sort of have a sober sort of reflection about exactly why a lot of these projects haven't worked in the past, and why they, in my opinion, they're not going to be really working in the for the struggles ahead that we need them to. I think they do replicate a lot of mistakes that have been made historically. You know, like George Galloway, you know, it's very, you know, he's somebody who's, he has a lot of appeal in some respects, but you know, a lot of it is shrouded in sort of ego and you know, being a bit of a demagogue, in my opinion. And there isn't necessarily, even though it says Workers' Party, I don't necessarily think it is actually made and run by workers themselves. And I think that's a feature of a lot of these sort of new left initiatives. So before I think we sort of prematurely say this is our new political home, we've got a website, we've got to sign up, we've got a few members, I think we do need a bit more period of sober reflection before we start saying this is the new political party, political project going forward. And obviously we've got a few things that are in their embryonic form that we want to support: the political education project, even some initiatives that are going on within Labour around Ian Lavery, the No Holding Back report and things like that. But I'm not, much like, you know, like a lot of activists, I'm not in any hurry to stamp my flag on yet another ill-conceived political project without fully looking at the lessons of what's gone before.
Yeah, that I think they're fair comments. I mean, I think it's understandable, isn't it, as you've said, why people, because there was such disappointment, it felt as if we got very close to something meaningful, even through that limited sort of parliamentary political system. If it felt like it was going in the right direction, and that we got very close to that. To have it snatched away in the way that it was. You know, I can understand why people are rushing for answers and alternatives, and especially if they're not feeling like the Labour Party can provide what it is that they were hoping, you know, we'd be able to realise. So under Corbyn, there again, you know, if people are starting to build things, there's not going to be an opportunity for them to stand for electoral candidates in the near future. We've got a few years to go yet. So if people are starting to give some shape to what policies might look like, there might be a point in the future where those groups can come together. Because I mean, I know I've looked at some of them and thought, yeah, that's really good. I like the way that they've set that out. I agree with that, and that. But there's this missing, you know. So it might be that we've got a jigsaw forming, and that some people are going to feel comforted by belonging to something and shaping it. But that maybe, I don't know, at some point in the future. But in the meantime, my instinct is the same as yours, is that what can we learn? Let's just take a breath. What can we learn from what's gone wrong? Why did it fail? What's happened in the past? You know, that can give us examples of how we can avoid that in the future, and build stronger as well. So how do you see things shaping up? Have you got any idea of how this might, do you think that some of those movements can be helpful in shaping this up in some way?
Well, absolutely. You know, no effort historically goes to waste. We need to look at all these efforts soberly and really dictate the best lessons from them and leave the worst behind. And we mentioned before about like the Hal Draper piece that we've looked at in our political education project about, you know, this idea of socialism from above and below, and, you know, this idea of trying to project forward a bit too clinically and forensically about what this perfect working class party is going to look like. You know, we're not utopians. We know that things have to be built for. So even though I've got some ideas, like a lot of people, about what this final project will be, the reality is that, you know, that will be shaped by hopefully a mass of working class people joining and actually shaping it themselves, and actually telling me and you and other people what that political party is going to look like. But obviously I do have some initial sort of suggestions about what we need to do. And I think the first thing is, you know, not replicating the mistakes that have gone in the past. I don't think there's any need for, you know, all left organisations, no matter what, to all come under the same umbrella, you know, and, you know, hope for the best at the next election. I think, you know, you've seen plenty of examples across Europe where that approach has not worked, you know, Syriza, PASOK, various others. And, you know, inevitably they end up replicating the same mistakes that a lot of the social democratic parties have done, Labour included over here in the UK. I think if we are going to be looking at some kind of model for what the new political alternative is going to be, I think it will involve a lot of the traditional left that we do have, obviously, in Britain. They do have a role to play. You know, a certain section, well, a massive section, say, of the membership of the Labour Party as it exists, whether they choose to stay in Labour or break away and form something else. But I think the closest models we're going to be looking at, I'd say, are more like the Latin American examples. So I think the movement for socialism in Bolivia is probably a good sort of model to be looking at as we start to develop our own alternative. Because what the movement for socialism does in Bolivia is it is a political organisation, if you like, but it is an organisation where that brings together other social movements underneath it. So they still remain autonomous. They still fight for whatever reform or whatever change or whatever economic or political demand they have as individual organisations. But they do agree on a common consensus that can be put forward at an election. And that's where obviously we get, you know, a fairly solidly left socialist government in Bolivia since 2006, Evo Morales and so on. So I think that is probably more the way I'd want us to go, rather than just saying, here's the new Socialist Party, let's just get people signed up who are a bit disaffected by what's happened under Keir Starmer. I think it's got to be harmonising the organisations that we've already got and that are doing some amazing stuff in communities, you know, right now, and trying to give them some kind of common banner and cause to work under.
Yeah. So that happens. Has that happened within the political system, within the existing political system? So it is possible to do that. It doesn't have to happen sort of outside of that system.
What system? Sorry.
So within Bolivia, how does it work? Because I'm not. You know, if you could explain a little bit more about? So do they stand candidates under a common banner, but they're not necessarily from the same party?
Absolutely, yes.
Yeah.
So you might have, I don't know, a trade union or a mass community wealth building initiative or something,
Yeah.
that work under the banner of Movement for Socialism.
Brilliant.
Movement for Socialism and socialism is ultimately the banner they stand under.
Yeah.
But they are still free to continue to pursue their own individual struggles wherever they may happen to be.
Yeah.
But and it does mean, obviously, it does away with this need for, one set fit program, to try and entertain loads of competing demands. People within the Movement for Socialism don't agree on everything. There is heated debate and disagreement about the direction they think the government should go in, but they have got an opportunity to shape that.
Amazing.
And still maintain their own autonomy.
Yeah. That sounds much better, because if you've got all your eggs in one basket, this is going to mix metaphors, but then you get one bad apple. The whole thing goes down, doesn't it? Is that what you kind of say? Yeah.
Well, absolutely. And, you just have a quick look at a lot of big left initiatives in the last 20, 30 odd years in Britain. It's all gone in the same direction.
Yeah.
The Stop the War Coalition, was possibly the last great attempt at, some kind of political alternative to Labour emerging in the wake of the Iraq War. And it has, 1 million people on the streets. It had a load of big speakers. It had sections of the Labour Party, breaking away. This was where Jeremy Corbyn, it started to enter the popular consciousness for a lot of people in his principled opposition to the war and being willing to challenge Tony Blair quite publicly about that.
Yeah.
And, within a matter of months, the entire thing was wrapped up and, put back in its box because its leaders didn't have the confidence in its working class base that it was attracting to actually push for that political alternative and end up descending into opportunism, lots of, controversy between the SWP and George Galloway and the Respect Party at the time. And a key opportunity, I think, for a left of Labour alternative was tragically lost at that stage. And we know obviously in the years after we really needed that. We definitely needed it for the 2007-8 crash, where Labour once again proved woefully inadequate to deal with the crises. And every single challenge that we've seen, whether it's economic, political or constitutional, the Labour Party has found to be completely inadequate in dealing with, because they essentially play by the same rule book that the Tories do. It's just with a red rosette, I'm afraid.
Yeah, I like the idea of that, more of a not a loose coalition, because you've got a very defined common cause. Because this is the problem, isn't it, with the left as well? We do have this tendency to split off on particular issues, and if as long as we can find core agreements, and we need to learn about our history, we need to learn about our socialist mentors, don't we, through history kind of thing. We need to do the reading and do the discussion so that we can be really, really clear on what we're seeing as the faults of the system, in order to be able to have common agreement on what we want to do to fix it, even if there are within that, individual disagreements about particular issues. And I mean, with, say, for example, Chris Williamson's movement, I think he's recently said that he is intending to make that a political party, intending for that to, become a political party. I like his focus on inclusion of the working class and creating a space for the working class, people who are politically alienated from socialist politics and being pulled, into other arenas, such as by the far right, because of that vacuum of inclusion. And I see that as one of the limits and failings of the Labour movement under Corbyn. I do feel as if that was an example of top down, because it was very sort of privileged and middle class dominated and run, and it didn't give space for those voices. It almost kind of glossed over that they'd been trashed politically, over the last few decades, by thinking that, well, it doesn't matter about that. We can regain their trust by just saying we're going to put up the minimum wage and we're going to, and it wasn't enough. It didn't go far enough. So have you got any sort of further thoughts about the limits of the Labour Party in political terms, the limits of, or how the working class have fared under Labour? Previously and recently.
Yeah, to unpack, I have to say. I'll try and take them a few at a time. Obviously, just first start to overlap a little bit.
Yeah.
I think first off, you're right. In terms of actually the failings of Corbynism, there were several, and I think one of them has to be the fact that in terms of the class of people it represented, I think a lot of people have got it wrong, really. I think in terms of, I'd like to think it was, made up of working class organic intellectuals coming forward spontaneously, when there was a call to arms from Corbyn, and, the Labour Party sort of got its act together. But it wasn't that at all. First and foremost, it was a political home, if you like, for some lower middle classes, maybe upper working classes perhaps, who found themselves very much so rejected and homeless, after years and years of Blairism failing them, and Ed Miliband proving to be no real remedy to the situation of Labour in 2013 onwards. So primarily the actual people who were doing the legwork for Corbynism weren't the working class.
Yeah. And
that's fine, on at times, we don't always have the luxury of having the demographic we want necessarily to but it's about what you do as a movement to empower those working class bases to get them on board. Yeah. So even if in the earlier days it was, primarily a student upper, semi-professional middle class sort of demographic, what are you doing to actually make sure that changes very rapidly? And fundamentally, a lot of the people who did get, do quite well out of Corbyn, it wasn't in their interest to have that many more diverse voices turn along to CLPs and upsetting things. They just wanted to, sort of take the bureaucratic methods that were already there in place, that, made sure that the same candidates were being selected for CLP nominations, the same motions were being passed at conference and so on, was going through. It's just now under slightly more left-wing management, if you like. But in terms of actually any authenticity coming from the working class themselves, they weren't interested in that. And Ian Lavery made the point, I think, just after the election defeat, said if you actually look at the demographic changes that occurred under Corbyn at CLP level, it was all in the south and southwest where the numbers were booming. It was not in the north. It wasn't in all the areas that, as we've seen, have just rejected Labour by a massive landslide. And it wasn't just Corbyn that caused it. It wasn't the phenomenon of Corbynism that did this. These were the underlying conditions that were there in the first place. Yeah. The drift away from the working class being at least partially the remit, if you like, of the Labour Party was had ebbed away long before that. The structures of the party were becoming overwhelmingly middle class. Yeah. And Corbyn offered a possibility to reverse that. Yeah. But he and people around him were not willing to push forward and fully, if you like, proletarianize the movement. And there was some key moments where they could have done it, Brexit being the key example, in my opinion, because it was the moment where we could have had, not only were the Tories in complete disarray, but the entire Labour Party right wing was in disarray after that. This was the perfect time to start clearing out the deadwood and start surrounding Corbyn with some proper class fighters. But that's the nature of power,
I feel, I don't know. I feel that is what's at the root of where things went wrong. And all the way through, I just felt so frustrated because it's interesting. You said people around him chose not to. There was that opportunity there. It was wide open. We could have done that. We could have found ways to make it. And one of the things that I kind of was discussing with you before was around safe spaces. And I know that terminology is not great. I don't like that. That we're all children and we need to be shepherded into safe spaces. We need to be able to debate, and politics is the rough and tumble of that, isn't it? That's how you get to consensus. That's how you get to a greater equality, really, whose voices are being heard and stuff. But I don't know. I've had a couple of really interesting conversations since we did our first interview with Deirdre O'Neill and with Lisa McKenzie, who are quite vocal about this because they're working class and they're in senior positions within academia, and they lecture and teach, and they're proactive. They put their theory into practice on sort of like social inequality, class inequality, and they can speak from lived experience, not just of having been working class and having come through that. They're still working class, and it's still a struggle, even though they're successful within their field. It's still really difficult because they are still middle class dominated spaces. So I don't think it's just within left politics. It's right across the board within academia or within a council or wherever you are, you know, like wherever you find yourself. If you're working class and you've done well, all of a sudden you bump up against these often invisible barriers to having your voice taken seriously, being spoken over, you know, the ways that you express your ideas being regarded as unsophisticated and not quite good enough, and all of these kinds of things. And it puts people off, you know, it's very off-putting. And so I personally think there is an argument to be made for, I don't know whether safe spaces is the right term, but yeah, like, you know, dedicated spaces might be a better terminology. And Lisa was dead good because she said, if you provided working class people with dedicated spaces within their own communities, and say, you know, your political educators were from working class backgrounds as well, people might shout over each other. They might not want, like, you know, to have to wait for their turn on the agenda and have to raise a point of order. And people are passionate about their politics and their issues, and they might not articulate them in a way that's considered tasteful within middle class circumstances either, or circles. But if you let people shout over each other, get their frustrations out, and learn about different theories and debate them, argue them in their own terms, on their own terms, eventually that shouting over each other would stop, and people would be able to sort of digest and make sense of, and no one would be looking down on how that is expressed. Because I do think a lot of the time discussions about the differences between the middle class relations to power structures and the working class relations to power structures is not a popular conversation within middle class dominated environments, because once you acknowledge it, you acknowledge that people who are middle class have achieved their success or relative success, you know, through a certain amount of privilege. So everyone's comfortable with talking about disadvantage, but people are much less comfortable about talking about unearned advantage. It's a really uncomfortable conversation. And I wonder if maybe that's why the people around Corbyn were like, no, stay away from that. Don't even have that conversation. Don't even acknowledge that. So we'll bring them along by just putting the right policies in place, you know. So I don't know. That's my take on it. And I know that there are other people from working class backgrounds that do agree with me on that, but I know that not everybody does. And I know it's felt to be a risky conversation in some circles. I mean, I don't know. What do you think? Have you got any thoughts on that? Or?
Yeah, a couple. Probably not as strongly as maybe Lisa and others on it, but I certainly do have some opinions. Just quickly going back to on the Corbyn thing you were saying there about, you know, the choice people made around him not to empower, you know, the potential for working class power,
Yeah.
you know, to actually, you know, start to clear away the deadwood and, you know, form the new layers of management and control of the Labour Party. Whether they want to or not, the reality is that a lot of these left-leaning liberals who are surrounding Corbyn are playing their role, which has historically always been played by, you know, the soft left, if you like, of the Labour Party, which is to be the managers and mediators of class antagonisms, and never at any point to actually do anything that could remedy the situation, i.e. actually empower some working class people to do something in their own way. God forbid. And that's, you know, been a poisonous legacy that's, you know, marked the entire history of struggle throughout the Labour Party. You know, even going back to its formation itself, it was a bourgeois workers' party, and leaderships may change, but ultimately that's what it's always has been and will be. You can do some decent stuff with that if you like occasionally. Obviously, we had that close call with under Corbyn, but ultimately, so long as the structures that any leader inherits are already set for him, you know, you know, these are people who do have a very cozy revolving door relationship with sections of the media, with civil service, even with the tops of corporations. You know, whatever breath of fresh air Corbyn was at the top, the layers underneath him were always going to be working to nullify and pacify any message he had to offer, to the point where, you know, one of the greatest socialists or elected socialists of our time has just been rejected, if you like, at the ballot box, and Eton boy Boris Johnson has just got a landslide. You know, that's the left that we're doing the soft left as just as much as it is the left and others. But just going back to what you said about working class spaces, I think the first port of call I'd say would be, and especially if you're in the Labour Party, is to have a look at the report Ian Lavery, John Trickett, and Laura Smith released earlier this year, the No Holding Back. No Hold Bad report, because it does identify some key reasons why Labour defeated and lost its working class base, but also some basic tangible things that the left should be doing anyway now. You know, so why aren't we setting up shop in the very communities that we say we're going to be representing? Why aren't we making use of the old working men's organisations or pubs or bars, which are, you know, especially under COVID, I've got an older use. Why aren't we working in there to actually create some kind of focus for community activism, you know, and actually drawing in the layers we say we want in this new movement? Why aren't we doing that? Why aren't we doing things like actually trying to offer some kind of like childcare for maybe single parents or who can't get along to the meetings, who otherwise might be interested in doing so? You know, why aren't we doing some very basic things that could actually start to freshen the numbers up, if you like, and actually bring working class people on board? And, you know, any new movement going forward is going to have to do that. In terms of actually creating a safe space, well, my first sort of reaction would be that most working class people I know will stand up and tell you very vociferously whether you're right or wrong or not. They don't ever want to feel like they're, you know, they've got a protected characteristic and need, you know, mechanisms to protect them in the form of a safe space. That isn't to say that we don't need to be doing some developing structures and mechanisms to make sure that we are attracting working class people, and that middle class people can't just come along and colonize social movements and, you know, repackage them in their own image. Because obviously, again, there's a long history of that occurring, where you know, working class people are able to, I know, attain some kind of role or function within a trade union or an anti-austerity organisation, and very quickly, you know, the professional middle class sort of activist layer very, you know, colonise and take it over and run it in their own way. So we do need to make sure that, you know, the democratic mechanisms that are in place in any new organisation are robust and do prevent this kind of thing from happening. You know, these should be fixtures and assets of the communities that they serve.
Yeah. I mean, I'm going to be careful how I say this because I still am a Labour Party member. But what if, right, the intention within the Labour Party is still not to do that? What if the people around the current leader, for example, are still advising against having this conversation about how we include working class voices and how we enable them to be emboldened, really, how we provide that? Because I mean, I, you know, maybe agree with you, maybe it would sound strange to have a protected characteristic around class, although it was kind of covered in the equalities legislation. It was intended to be in there, but it just was airbrushed. It wasn't enacted by the coalition government. I think because the other groups that suffer, you know, as a common group, they have this that they're at a distance from power and influence, or they have been. So, you know, BAME communities, women, for example, as they have been able to understand how those power dynamics work, they've had a period of justifiable anger and the light bulb going on about why this is unfair. It's been painted out, and it's kind of covered very clearly with things like within things like sociology, you know, courses and things like that. Class used to be, but it's not. This is something that I was discussing with Lisa. I asked her, you know, I said, like, years ago, class used to be the bedrock of sociology. It used to be the first thing we talked about, and not just Marxism looking at it from a purely economic point of view, but also Bourdieusianism and looking at the cultural aspects of that and the intricacies of that. And it was all unpacked, and there was loads of really brilliant academic studies and evidence around that. And there was an opportunity to see it, because, you know, if you're in a disempowered group, you know you are, and you know it's unfair, but you can't articulate it in a way that's going to enable you to change that system if you haven't been able to have access to those studies and that knowledge, and you haven't had an opportunity to become justifiably angry about it. And I think that's what she was saying. It was like, we need these shared spaces where people can access that knowledge and on their own terms be really bloody angry about it, and then start to put some of that, the tools of that knowledge, into action on their own terms. You know, there's something powerful in that we haven't done. We haven't ever really done, you know, within the Labour Party, I don't think. Although to an extent maybe within the unions, you know, back in the 70s, 80s or whatever. And then it just changed, it stopped, and it's like it's been stemmed and it's not been allowed to reach its conclusion, so that people from those backgrounds can take an equal part in the struggle alongside other disempowered groups. So I was leading on to something. All right, Crispin Flintoff, right, in the NEC elections, I think it was a few months ago, he'd proposed that 50% of member subs within the party should go to CLPs, so that CLPs can do exactly what you've been saying. So some of these buildings like working men's clubs or whatever, I mean, like my ward, there's a lot of deprivation, so, you know, socioeconomic deprivation within my ward, and all of the things that go with that. And there's a really amazing conservative club right in the middle of it.
That'd be a nice irony, wouldn't it?
Yeah, we've got nothing. There's nothing. Labour's got nothing. You know, we'll struggle to scrape together the membership donations to rent a room, you know, in in a building to have meeting, or we did before the lockdown. And it's like, I think you're right. We need physical spaces, you know, where in those communities really, where people can have these conversations in an unguarded way. Yeah.
Exactly. And
Yeah.
it's like, I mean, one aspect is obviously the political education side. Like you said, it's actually making sure there is an opportunity for these ideas to be exchanged in a way where, you know, it's not on social media and, you know, vulnerable to the same problems that all miscommunication is on social media. It is where people actually can meet face to face and talk about shared struggles and, you know, come up with tangible solutions to those problems. The theory is absolutely essential to guiding any movement that comes from that, but the first relation has got to be a recognition of shared exploitation and shared struggle. That is where the instinctive understanding of what is wrong with the system comes from, and ultimately what needs to go in its place. And how else are you going to do that unless you're creating situations where working class people and, you know, can come together and communicate. And especially in, you know, the post-Thatcherite era that we're living in, these opportunities for working class collaboration and organisation are increasingly few and far between. And it's been calculated for that to be the case. You know, so even the culture of, you know, after work drinks where people, you know, manual labourers might get together and just a basic level sort of diagnostic of what's gone on in the day and what's wrong with management and so on. You know, a lot of that is in steady decline. And we've got to be trying to not necessarily be nostalgic about the relations of the past and struggles of the past. It's about, you know, creating a system that is serves the needs of the working class in the 21st century in all of its diverse needs, wants and desires.
Yeah. I do think like that when you talk about shared exploitation and shared struggle, I mean, in terms of the economics, the working class, in terms of, it's not the 99%, but maybe like the 90% or whatever, they've got that shared, as Marx outlined it, you know, they're not the owners of the means of production. So means of production is the tools and the buildings and everything that makes work possible, but they're the providers of labour within that system that profit is then creamed off by capitalists. And that needs to go. My understanding of it is that sort of creaming off of profit has to, what happens with capital from that is that it has to keep moving, and it has to keep moving and accumulating faster and faster, or the thing falls on its arse. Is that a fair assessment? And does that explain why we've got like decline in terms and conditions, and with this constantly squeezing more out of people in terms, especially at the bottom of the heap, in terms of what they expect in terms of labour, what they're going to give you in terms of your rights, you know, what they expect in terms of flexibility and stuff, because it's a ravenous monster that just has to keep going faster and faster and accumulating more and more, or it collapses. Is that right? Have I understood it right? Yeah.
That's a fairly good succinct evaluation of what capitalism is from the Marxist point of view. Of course it is.
Yeah.
the basic thing to say about it is that you can't have a situation of indefinite growth and economic prosperity on a planet of finite resource. The two principles cannot reconcile together.
Yeah.
And that has its impacts, obviously, on the workforce itself in terms of greater exploitation, greater work discipline, the environmental implications that has on continuous growth without consequence or thought. You know, the entirety of the global system, if you like, is capitalist, and this that as a bedrock is rotten to the core because it can only ever serve the interests of profit. It doesn't necessarily matter who the individual capitalists are necessarily. You know, obviously, I don't like Philip Green or Alan Sugar any more than any other right-minded thinking socialist does. But they are just, you know, minor avatars for the system. It's the system itself we need to get to the root.
So what about good business then? Because I think in Starmer's speech the other day, he was laying out like, I think there quite a lot, I haven't watched it, but I've just seen some of the commentary from people coming out of it. I mean, he's got a backdrop of like pink and purple and blue. It's like we're thinking back to Blair and now, you know, Mandelson and etc. Like he mentions about good businesses. What do you think about that? You know, can you have good businesses within a system that's fundamentally flawed? Is that a road to nowhere? Do we need to be more honest about that?
I think you've got to be careful, especially how you sort of compartmentalize what is a good and a bad business in that circumstance, because the tendency might be that, oh, it's just, you know, a couple running a local shop or a bar or something, and they employ one or two staff, and you know, it's a generally nice little family dynamic and so on. You know, within that will be, you know, layers and layers of exploitation, which might not be as egregious as what Amazon do to their workers or Uber do to their workers, but that exploitation is still there. Now, that in terms of political priorities, of course, for a new socialist and political movement, obviously our big fight, you know, needs to start with wherever this exploitation does occur, whether that is you know, what seems to be a nice little family run business, or it is, you know, a big corporate international giant. And you know, there is a possibility, if you like, in the short term, perhaps for, you know, some businesses to perhaps be on board with you know, wanting to do, you know, create a better area, you know, improve the life chances. And you know, these people do exist. You know, there's great acts of philanthropy that do come from these layers of people. I'm not going to ignore that. And you know, what I think struggles do, you know, as class struggles intensify, this middling layer of people, if you like, do tend to pick a side. And you know, it's up to us as an organised working class movement to make the more compelling case for why they should be on our side, if you like, and understand their role within it.
That makes sense. Like in a family-run business that provides jobs and it provides a friendly, supportive environment, whatever, it's providing a service for the community. There's no intentional exploitation there whatsoever, is there? It's just that it's inherently part of a bigger system that by its very nature can only ever be exploitative and increasingly so. And as you said, you know, damaging to the planet. And it's like that conversation, it feels to me that conversation hasn't yet been had properly within the party, but needs to be had given the situation that we're in at the moment. Do you want to add anything more to that before I move on to because we've got our next political education project session coming up, and it ties in with kind of where we're at in the conversation. So
no, I mean, I suppose the only thing I would say briefly is that no matter who the employer is, if you like, you know, there is clearly an emerging need. It's been here for some time for representation for the sort of like the gig economy workers and those who aren't, you know, getting a standard, you know, contracts, who are inching away on 0-hour contracts, whether that is for Amazon or for you know, for some local family-run enterprise. And I think there is a massive need for the left now and the trade union movement to understand that the labour movement they're dealing with, they think it's still the labour movement of 30, 40 odd years ago in many cases, and things have changed, and we need to understand the very precarious position. That's why the word is used, precariat, you know, for these people. These are people who are should be naturally in tune to what our thinking is as socialists, and we're not finding the ways to actually organise and get in there. And this pool of people is growing all the time.
Yeah.
Under COVID, especially, the numbers working for Uber and others have exploded. You know, and our Praxis on the left needs to radically and quickly oriented towards a lot of these workers.
Definitely. That's the point, isn't it? That you might have a nice good business, as was described by Starmer, but you're going to have a decreasing number of those. You know, just because of the nature of the capitalist system, it requires that we have an exploding number of people, you know, being exploited within 0 hours, you know, with no terms and conditions, no holiday pay, etc. It's a ravenous system. So we're going to have a decreasing number of people who are able to survive as good businesses because of the nature of the system, you know. And if we don't address that, you can't really support those good businesses, because that system's going to swallow them up, and it already is doing. So one of the things that Joe Guinan talks about is the impact of the COVID pandemic on medium and smaller businesses, and the fact that they've not been able to. I mean, there have been some larger, you know, big exploitative monsters that have gone under, but by and large, you know, the ones that the government are not providing adequate support to, that are going to go under, are going to be the media. They're going to be the good businesses. They're going to be the smaller ones, the family-run ones, etc. And they're going to be, you know, when the economy, if and when, opens back up, they're going to be consumed by these big exploitative corporations, and we're going to have yet more people who aren't employed by good businesses but are employed by exploitative huge employers that can do whatever the hell they want. And that's where we're heading, and it's going to be accelerated, you know, by COVID. So it does seem really important that we address that underlying system at this point. It's like a crunch point. It cannot kind of be ignored. Would you agree?
Oh, completely.
Yeah.
I think it was both the hypocrisy of a lot of, you know, Labour councillors and, you know, a lot of the hierarchy, if you like, on this matter. It's not hypocrisy for the Tories, because they quite openly tell you what they're going to do. You know, the Tories and certain sections of the Labour Party, you know, do have a base of support amongst this middling layer, if you like. And, you know, the Tories are very good at painting this image of the green and pleasant land they're going to restore. But they don't hide behind the fact that, you know, in reality, we are just here to award multi-billion-dollar pound contracts to the highest bidder. And we do not have any sentiment for your local community. We don't care if we, you know, make it so that, you know, the small and medium-sized enterprises can't flourish. You know, they have no nostalgia or sentiment in that regard. It's the rule of capital that they defend. And
that they're invested in as well.
Absolutely, yeah. The myriad of between the Tory party and big business is overwhelming. But again, same with the Labour Party. Every health secretary under Labour went on to serve on one of the privatised boards that have benefited from lucrative contracts from the NHS. And, you know, I do find it very hypocritical for a lot of sort of some Labour councillors now that are coming out in Manchester, like in Tameside, there's issues to do with big business trying to build on green spaces. You know, Tameside has got a lot of greenery, and absolutely the Labour councillors are right to oppose it, you know, and do protests and petitions. But it's a system they've supported in the first place. They've created the situation where big business locally and nationally can have overwhelming sway over council decision making, over due process, and, you know, they will eventually get the way and get their big industrial monstrosity put on one of Manchester's few green spaces. You know, it's a struggle that's ongoing now in Tameside, and the Labour Party, they're guilty of hypocrisy on this. It's something that Tony Blair and the PFI wouldn't have thought was a wonderful idea.
Yeah, and that's not lost on the working class, is it? So as long as you're defending that, you know, but people who are working class, they have seen that movement, you know, as you've said, like health secretaries moving on to lucrative privatised NHS positions. Working class people are aware of that. That stinks to high heaven. And if we don't address those fundamental things, and we don't, it's like, I think working class people do have a pretty good handle on how exploitation works, but they don't see us standing up for them, and they don't see us acknowledging it, you know, in the way that we need to be. The next session from the Political Education Project, last one was about sort of socialism from, what was it, top down or grassroots up kind of thing.
Yeah, this what is socialism, but it then came in, how do we define that, bottom up or top down, wasn't it? Yeah.
This next one is COVID, climate and capitalist crises, and they've put together a briefing note, and they've also recorded it. So there's, if you go on their Twitter, which I'll put the address on here for, you'll be able to go on. If you haven't got time to read through it, you can listen to it. You can listen a few times. It's actually, I think this one, it's quite, it's brilliant. I love the way it's written. It's quite relevant to what's happening today, and it's quite easy to digest, I think. And I'll just read out the first paragraph, and then you can take it from there with any comments that you have about this, because it kind of links in with what we're saying. So it says that we are in the midst of a major crisis or series of overlapping crises is uncontroversial. Even the most orthodox voices of the capitalist status quo, from the United States Department of the Treasury or the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, the OECD, now recognize this openly. And then it goes on to say Janet Yellen, she's President Biden's newly appointed Secretary of the Treasury and one of the most important economic policy officers in the US government, wrote in her day one message to her departmental staff of the 4 historic crises facing the new administration. So she said COVID is one, but in addition to the pandemic, the country is also facing a climate crisis, and she said a crisis of systemic racism and an economic crisis that has been building for 50 years. Now, I would say, I wouldn't necessarily single out systemic racism, because I think if you're looking at the number of disproportionate deaths and the amount of sort of violence within society, you need to include class, you need to include women, you need to include disabled people. All of that's there. It might not be as obvious on the streets, but people are dying as a result of their class, as a result of being female, you know, as well as a result of their race. So I think it's more than 4. You know, we've got a whole raft of disasters that are happening and coming to a head as a result of this, well, what she describes as an economic crisis that's been building for 50 years. And what's surprising about that to me is that that administration is thought of as being along a similar path to maybe Starmerism, if there is such a thing, or Blairism, in that it doesn't normally directly acknowledge that the capitalist system is fucked. And there's no way of stopping it from being fucked. It just is. It's inherent within it that we're going to land where we've landed now. And so I just thought it was interesting. They've started out with that. Is that the beginnings of an acknowledgement that the actual economic system is what's to blame for all of these things that are going belly up? Do you think?
Well, if it is, you know, it's a very pale one, and there's no incentive actually to do what's necessary to remedy the situation. You know, yeah, obviously capitalism is in crisis, and even its, you know, most senior pundits and defenders have got to acknowledge those symptoms as they arise. Otherwise, they can't be taken terribly seriously at the ballot box, can they? And you know, a lot of this will be to do with best managing the dissent that follows. You know, making sure that any organisation that does emerge to try and resist the continued decline of capitalism and make, you know, defend working class interests from them being the people who get punished the most by that decline, is to make sure that those organisations stay within the Democratic Party orbit or the Labour Party orbit. They don't take on a life of their own, and that, you know, the Labour Party and the Democratic Party in America can continue to do what they've always done, which is to be the safety valve, if you like, for working class radicalism, and make sure that, yeah, whilst we are acknowledging there are issues to do with inequality, the environment, systemic racism, and various other things, that those struggles are contained within the apparatus of the state, if you like, or within the pacifying atmosphere of the Labour or Democratic parties.
Yeah, later on in this what they called it, briefing note, they've quoted Ashok Modi, who's formerly a deputy director of the IMF, International Monetary Fund, who wrote up a Groundhog Day scenario in which the IMF kept its forecasts wrong because it failed to recognize the endemic weaknesses in the world economy. So again, it's like some acknowledgement of endemic weaknesses, but like you say, it's not spelled out what that means. But at least it is. It's surprising to me that there's any acknowledgement of it at all, because it seems as if, people within those sort of establishment structures want to keep a million miles away from ever acknowledging things like that, or things like class discrimination. And one of the things that Lisa McKenzie had said to me was, the minute it's easier to address things like racism or sexism or sexism or whatever as horrible things that we want to deal with that are systemic, that don't require us to address the underlying economic flawed system, whereas class discrimination forces you to open up that conversation. And that might be one of the reasons why there's this determination not to go anywhere near, another reason why there's a determination not to go anywhere near it. What do you think?
Yeah, exactly. I'm all for supporting things like the Equalities Act, of course, which has given a very weak trade union movement at least some apparatus to work with when dealing with exploitation within the workplace.
Yeah.
And so it does set out, some very acceptable and understandable conditions for what discrimination and would constitute for disabled people, for trans people, for LGBT, for women, and so on. But like you said, this is all a reaction, and we don't say it is to class, it's to the class system. And that's probably partly the reason why it wasn't ultimately acknowledged as a sort of protected characteristic in the Equalities Act, because we don't really want to acknowledge at all that, every generation seems to think that, class antagonisms is something that's been buried and it's part of the past. It was dealt with in the Victorian era, or it was dealt with at the end of World War II, and so on and so forth.
Yeah.
But, every generation has found and will continue to find that however much you think you've buried class antagonisms, you open that coffin and they're still there, alive and kicking. And they can manifest and appear in weird and wonderful ways. And as capitalist crises continue to intensify, the question of class becomes ever harder to ignore. And so the role of the IMF and the role of big governmental organizations is to try and disguise that as best as possible, and acknowledge that the economy is realigning, it is changing. So the era of neoliberalism and is supposed to be in decline and dying, and we are supposed to be seeing more of a period of the state taking on more responsibility again. So obviously it started off with like protectionism under Donald Trump, but now obviously COVID has meant that there's going to have to be more of a robust state response to dealing with crumbling infrastructure, which Carillion and various others who we've given big billion-pound contracts to have all but failed. This is part of the reason we can't do decent social distancing in schools, because we're dealing with made-for-profit buildings that the government of the day don't really have fundamental control over. So there is going to be, obviously, a period of the state taking on a renewed role within capitalist society, if you like. But ultimately, it's a role that is there to just award contracts as best as possible. And the entire experience of COVID has proven that even someone like Boris Johnson with a massive mandate can't just assume control of the apparatus of government and run it as he'd like to. The system is run, the very structures of power are there to make sure that whoever gets elected in that role can't really lead, if you like. The deals are already there, the arrangements are already there to make sure that a steady flow of investment from the taxpayer goes straight to the private sector without any critical oversight or accountability. And we've seen symptoms of that with the Test and Trace app and various other snake oil solutions that have been flogged to us over COVID, and that's going to continue, beyond this crisis.
Yeah, I mean, he has to be prepared to acquiesce to that. He seems to be more than happy to.
Yeah,
that's why he's there, isn't it? Yeah, I mean, like I feel that working class people, obviously we do share in common that we don't own the means of production, and you could say that's 80% of the population, but the actual lived experience of how that translates is very, very different. So if you're talking about, the effect that that's had on your life is that you can't afford food and You get treated like shit every day. You've got no status whatsoever. You're getting controlled. Like there's more surveillance, isn't there, on the working class than there is on the middle class. That's one of the most recent things that's a turn that's been taken. So people are being monitored, you know, for much more closely. Like we had the thing with Sports Direct where people could only go so long to the loo and there was ambulances turning up to take people away. Those kind of things don't happen to middle class people in middle class careers. So if you have spaces where you have everyone in the room and you've got a middle class educator telling you we share the same exploitation, it's hard to take that seriously. And that's why I feel it's really important that we have people who are working class and who are educated about how this works, conveying the theory in a way that's digestible and credible. Credibility is really important, I think, for winning hearts and minds. Now, imagine that, you know, Starmer wasn't interested in doing that and he wasn't going to give us like 50% so that we can all take over the redundant buildings. It's like, you know, difficult to imagine, I know, but just say that was the case. Like, how do we do that as a multifaceted socialist movement? We've got all these different groups all kind of pulling in towards the same aim. You know, you've got your Chris Williamson movement, you've got your George Galloway, you've got the Political Education Project, and you've got tenants unions, and they're brilliant because they give people, Alison was telling me in her interview, when people come to them in dire straits, they give people an active role, so they all chip in and help, but they don't do it on behalf of, they do it alongside with. Absolutely brilliant model, you know, and this is why I really like Paul O'Connell's approach to political education, because it's very much, right, come on, I know all this, you know, I could run this course, but let's have everybody chipping in and taking a role as well, in leading off on subjects and preparing readings for others. And it doesn't have to be perfect, but let's get people doing as well as listening. Say Starmer wasn't in favour of doing that within working class communities. Like, how could we make that happen? How could we? Do we need a fundraiser or an agreed model across organisation? Is it worth us looking at pulling something together around that?
Well, I mean, obviously, in the media, ideally, we'd love for this, you know, proper left of Labour organisation that's got a national profile to be filling the void that Keir Starmer has very happily vacated. You know, we'd love for that to happen overnight, but it's not going to get there without the actual work at the grassroots level. So, you know, obviously you mentioned Joe Guinan's work there. You know, we had him speak at one of our sessions a few months ago, didn't we? And he was very open about, you know, the role that community wealth building, community wealth building initiatives are going to play in the coming struggles. And I think I don't want to, there's a lot of technicalities to unpack with what we mean by community wealth building and so on. So I don't think we're going to do justice necessarily in this interview, but it is about, you know, looking at soberly at the communities that have felt left behind, those working class communities, and looking at what resources they do have and what an organised left or an organised cooperative movement in the area could do to revitalise them for, you know, to be used and enjoyed by working class people again. Whereas, you know, all the capitalist market has done is guarantee greater misery and further abandonment of these very communities that, you know, should be, you know, felt abandoned for the last 30, 40 odd years. So I think it's finding those embryonic sort of struggles that are emerging in the communities now and starting to intervene as an organised left or to give them a greater deal of organisation and direction, if you like. So whether it is, you know, some rundown shops in an area that are going to rack and ruin, you know, how can we as an organised left, you know, work in those communities to revitalise them for public utility? How can we build the confidence for, you know, mutual aid initiatives where they are needed within communities? How can we put the skills of people who are able to cook and maybe actually do, you know, affordable meals for a deprived community? You know, how can we do these kind of things alongside the political education? And, you know, there was a great quote from Ambelvar Sivanandan, who we did when we looked at issues to do with race relations. And he said, basically, you know, we need to create a political culture that doesn't accept the ruling ideas of the ruling class.
Mm-hmm.
And that is ultimately what we need to be doing in an embryonic form, wherever we can, at grassroots level.
Yeah.
And the way that might take shape is going to be different. Joe Guinan was very open about the fact that there have been some failed attempts, some efforts maybe from small and medium-sized enterprise to move in and exploit an emerging need in the community. But overwhelmingly, I think community wealth building is going to be the way forward. It's a way also to bring people together who don't share a political banner, if you like it. So this will mean that we will be end up rubbing shoulders with voters, heaven forbid. But how else are we going to create some kind of ambitious working class movement that addresses these concerns? Because the paltry efforts of Keir Starmer are not going to do it.
No.
Tactically having the Union Jack on in the background whilst you deliver your little pro-business speech isn't really what the working class want, really. And it's not the reason why they turned away from Labour in massive droves last year.
If he's interested in re-engaging them, I would say that's the opposite direction of the one we need to be going in. But I agree with you. I think community wealth building initiatives and cooperatives that are well run in the true spirit of what a cooperative is intended to do, they're praxis. They're that theory in practice. So you don't necessarily even have to run a big, long political education course. You can just say, here's an alternative way of doing local economics. Here's an alternative way of running something democratically and making a better wage and looking after yourselves and your community in a healthier way, allows more interaction, more work life.
A vision of the society you want to create.
Yeah.
Show that in a concrete way at a local level and a small scale level. Then you gain confidence to say, well, okay, well, maybe I will lend you a vote at the next election then.
Yeah.
Or we will do this, and this is where a political organisation takes form.
Yeah.
But it's not going to come from the top-down efforts of
flag waving.
The Labour Party now, I'm afraid.
No, I agree. So the next session, then I'll just read this out. This is the next one. I hope people will come along. If you look on at PolEdProj on Twitter or Political Education Project on Facebook, you'll be able to find the read-in for next time. You need to sign up, and then by email you'll get the invitation link into the session and the discussion. It's not something you need to speak up in. I don't think you can at the moment anyway. I think it's just we're listening and we're posting things in the question in the chat if we've got questions that we want to ask. But I think they're looking at how they can make it more interactive. But there's no pressure on anyone. It's there and it's free for people to sort of dip in as they feel comfortable, which I think is really good. I'll post the link to the reading on this one, and I'll if you could send me the Sivanandan, if you've got that link, I'll put that in the thingy as well. So just when I do these readings, it's probably the same. It's probably different for each of us depending on how much studying you've done of these things. But some of it goes over my head completely, and Alison said she's the same. But some of it really hits you. It's worth going through it, even though you go through bits I'm not quite sure what that means, because there are bits that really hit you between the eyes and you go, okay, that makes sense, and that's how you learn, isn't it, with these things. So this paragraph here: we will never be able to go far enough or fast enough doing the right things on climate or economic equality without addressing the defining features of our political economic system, which continuously works against equitable, sustainable solutions. This conclusion that we must address the nature, design, and implications of the capitalist system has very radical implications, so the system itself. In fact, it was the very conclusion reached by the socialist thinkers of the late 19th and early 20th centuries, as well as much of the environmental movement of the 60s and 70s. Many of the deep economic and societal transformation many of the leading environmental thinkers and practitioners of that period concluded that deep economic and societal transformation was needed if we were to succeed in saving our planet. GDP and the national income accounts were challenged for their failure to tell us the things that really matter. The overall point was that we should strike at the root causes of economic concentration and environmental decline. Doing so would require us to seek fundamental changes in our prevailing system to proceed down the path of system change. In other words, the problem was and is the system itself. The two major systemic problems, economic and environmental, we are facing are in fact two sides of the same coin. To solve one, we must solve the other. And there are ways that hold promise for solving both at the same time. So that next session is kind of based around a discussion of that proposition, whether we agree with it, maybe at which points in history we've come close to it and what's prevented that, you know, or what needs to change now to make sure that the conversation about how we rebuild, you know, and make sure that we don't then crash into an environmental disaster, and we don't see inequality getting much worse really quickly, has to involve focusing on the underlying capitalist system and how that works. So hopefully people will come along. Any final thoughts before we wrap up?
No, I think just on the issue of the environment and capitalism, if you like, I think it is right to say that they are two sides of the same coin. Absolutely. You're not going to solve the environmental disaster if you don't solve the economic and class antagonisms behind it. And, you know, it can be a nice sort of little virtue signal for some leafy liberals, you know, shopping in the right way and their bag for life and so on and so forth. But it's not a privilege for all working class people. And the risk is that if it doesn't become a class issue, then we'll just create another industry, if you like, you know, within capitalism that is there to protect capitalist profit and, you know, award sort of, you know, green tech companies lucrative state contracts. And, you know,
they making money off the crisis until we all fry.
Absolutely. And you know, this is where, you know, Corbyn was offering some solutions, if you like, and, you know, what a proper socialist movement should do. You know, it should go hand in hand with, well, how are we going to create, you know, 1 million new green jobs in the next like 5-10 years or so on? How are we going to, you know, solve the economic and the environmental crisis together, because they are inextricably linked. And if you don't acknowledge that, then you're not really that devoted to solving the environmental crisis at all. So.
I think that the Green Party's good on its social inequality, isn't it, these days, I think, but it's still very middle class dominated, and the whole green agenda is as well, and it's not all that relatable to people who are struggling, you know, becoming more and more sort of coming under the cosh of surveillance and downward pressure on their pay and all that kind of thing, having to work in dangerous conditions, you know, atomized from each other, not in a great position to unionize in certain lines of work. So somehow we've got to make that movement less judgmental of the fact that working class people don't we've got to understand why it is that working class people haven't jumped on board with the green agenda, and we've got to make it relevant to them by saying, you know, this is what the vision of the future would look like, this is what your job would look like, you know, this is how it would be different from how it is now. And it's a shame really that I've seen within the environmental movement some people are very averse to linking climate degradation to capitalism. There is that section, but I think the green movement now has gained so much traction that we could be an incredibly powerful force if we made sure that we acknowledged that class barrier within the green campaign, you know, within the climate change campaign. And that's one of the reasons why within the poverty emergency, I've done that side by side with the climate emergency. They need to sit right at the center of how we rebuild. And they both, at the root of both of them, you know, this problem of capitalism, it needs to be openly acknowledged, you know. And if it's not going to be openly and clearly acknowledged at the top, which it probably won't, then it's for us, you know, to make spaces within the communities and make sure that people get to see, you know, like you said, small scale alternatives and little seeds of the way forward, you know, through community wealth building and so on.
Otherwise, it just becomes another abstract thing that, you know, isn't the working class to be interested in. You know, it's got to be part of their tangible lived reality. Of course it does. At the minute, you know, sadly, I've got quite a professional middle class activist campaign who lead a lot of the green movement, if you like. And I've got zero appeal to the vast majority of working class people in this country or anywhere else, because they're not willing to acknowledge, like I said, the inseparable relationship between the law of capital and the environmental disaster. And this is where you are going to get, you know, working class people who should be interested roll their eyes when you raise the issue, because the people who are forward in the arguments, you know, have got no way of reconciling what a new green economy would look like. And if, you know, because they still wed themselves to the idea that capitalism can be made a bit prettier, then they're not going to make the radical appeal that's necessary to get working class people on board. So
I agree. Fab. So I think that probably brings us to a good conclusion with this session. We've talked quite a long time again. There's probably loads more we could say still, but I've really enjoyed that. It was a good chat. So just like to say thanks very much for coming back on. And I'll probably see you at the next political education project session, or at the Beehive, one or the other.
Absolutely, and with this website, I'll happily get on board with writing and putting out some more material.
Fabulous.
Yeah, it's going to be fantastic.
Brilliant. Thank you very much.
No problem. Thank you.
Democracy.